Namaste, Namaskar, Namaskara, from where I come. I have the rare predicament, I must say, of being the tail-ender batsman in a T20 match. Yes, after all the Sachin Tendulkars and the Dhonis have batted, the last few overs are left. So please bear with me. I'm going to take you on a very short journey into the world of ragas and rasas and how we cognize music. And I'm hoping this will be of use to you. I'm hoping that this will leave you to experience music in a totally different dimension. Okay, so before we start off any inquiry, and this is a personal habit of mine, I always ask the question, why bother with this question? Because you may all agree or disagree with this, but the maturity of a scientific discipline, any discipline for that matter, is not in the way in which we ask intelligent seeming questions, but is asking the question whether this will reel off relevant answers. How do we take the wheel forward? There are very many intelligent questions that we may ask on a particular subject, but very few of those answers are relevant. Either in a generative fashion, they may not be relevant to moving the wheel forward of knowledge. So how many of you, since I'm a cognitive neuroscientist and I like to do experiments, how many of you, to set the preface for this talk, how many of you actually feel that the brain computes music? Raise your hands. Okay. How many of you feel that the brain is a very accurate computational machine? Wow, okay. How many of you feel that the perception game, right, the game of perception by the brain is a precise process? Does the brain take shortcuts? Yeah. Why is it important to take shortcuts? Overwhelm, cognitive overload. Okay. Why else do you think it's important to have heuristics for the brain? Does it compute? Does it follow an algorithmic method for everything? Is it giving itself multiple choice questions and saying, I like B? So, why bother with Raga Engineering and Neuroaesthetics of Indian classical music? Isn't this the khayali pulav of musicians and musicologists who have a lot of time to spare and perhaps like to use their intellectual analytical faculties into the assessment of how the pratimadhyam should be blended with the tivra madhyam and landing into this perfect panchama to create the shajja panchama bhava and so on, right? Why should we be in this world, in this 2 days of exponential technologies, artificial intelligence, and some very natural stupidity? To top that, why should we be bothered about raga, neuroaesthetics, ragas? Yeah, it's all ancient and nice, but why bother with all of this? Turns out, it's very difficult to study the brain in situ. We may have cracked the brain, we may have cracked this black box, we know how to read brain waves perhaps. We can hook up our brains to electrodes and find out that we are beta dominant, alpha deficient, and gamma sensitive and all of that. But we may have cracked that box. We may even know that this neuron near the Broca's area is getting activated when Deepti is saying nonsense. We may even be, we have gotten to that point, but we have not cracked experience. We have not cracked human experience. What is the hard problem of consciousness? Does anybody know? The person who cracks this will get the next Nobel for sure. What is the hard problem of consciousness? It's a very soft problem actually, because everything is Brahma Vidya until you crack it, right? Then it is Koti Vidya, as they say in Kannada. Anybody, any takers? You may say that I'm having a happy experience, I may be able to hook my brain to an electrode and then it may show through a combination of alpha, beta, theta, gamma waves that I'm indeed happy and my neural correlates of this happy experience is X, Y, and Z. But if I trigger the very same neuron with, say, an electrical impulse of happiness, can I recreate that happy experience in a man? It's impossible. Yeah, so you may understand the neural correlates of experience or the neural correlates of consciousness, but you will never be able to replicate it in a lab. At least we have not been able to do that till date. So why is this important for neuroaesthetics? Yada, yada, yada. So it's all about this question. Do you think of the brain as the central nervous system, the superhero, or is the brain the survivor? There's a hangover in neuroscience today that the brain is often thought of as the mastermind. It's an emergent thing, Raghuji was saying. It's an emergent phenomenon that comes from having a brain, apparently. Can you have consciousness without the body? Is brain a sufficient condition to actually have consciousness, experience something, and be aware that you're experiencing what is experienced? So these are all questions we have still not cracked. So turns out music is a fascinating window to understand how the brain constructs experience. And what do we mean by experience? How do we cognize meaning? How do we sense something? And how do we feel something? The end product, the deliverable may be an emotion, it may be an ascribable verbal description of something, or it could be its most sublime rasa at the end of it. Whatever it is, the end product is engineered through a system of maneuvers in sound, gesticulations, gestures in sound, which the Shrotru or the Rasika perceives and is able to experience a certain rasa. So this construction of experience is phenomenally hard to study in a lab, for that matter. So it becomes very important to actually study it in situ, as they say, in the context in which the actual experience is unfolding, in the context in which the experience is unraveling, so to speak. So, perception of music. How many of us believe that we're all Sheldons? If you've watched Big Bang Theory, we process sound, we compute sound, we break down sound into pitch, rhythm, beats per minute, hertz, microhertz, 1 cent, 3 cents, 4 cents. The difference between Rishabha and Gandhara is 95.357 cents. Right? Are we thinking like that? Are we thinking concretely like that? Or are we thinking like Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes? That remains to be seen. So the problem with the current model of music perception is that it has an extremely strong computational hangover. And this is not by accident. When these advances in neuroscience was happening, the information theory was at its pinnacle. We started looking at the brain as a computational machine, something that processes things, breaks down things, reduces things, and then identifies these component parts as discrete objects, and then magically puts it all together, and then represents it in an abstruse form in the brain so that it is retrieved immediately. And the sad story in this is that if the poor brain had to do all this, how long do you think it would take to have a single thought? About 4 hours. How long do you think it would take to make sense of a single note? If you had to take sa and then do it's the sound is, and then there's an and then I think the hum is about 220 hertz. Right? You're not doing that. Your brain's not doing that. You're rather listening to the sound of it, the shape of it. You're looking at global parameters of the sound first, rather than are you computing and processing it in the way that information theory thinks the brain is processing it. So the hangover is that we have not been able to decode experience of music or music perception at a higher level is because we have been obsessed with this processing idea, and necessarily the idea that processing is about breaking something which is more composite into its subcomposite parts, and then assuming that the representation of this knowledge is in the same form as the form in which the musical stimulus was heard. So, if you hear Padani Sani Da Pamagari, then one neuron, poor neuron in the brain is holding the pa. Padanisa, then there's one more neuron which is saying, oh, I'm next to you, hi. I'm holding the dha. Musical memory is not stored in the same form and formats and configurations as it is heard, right? What the brain manages to do is an extraordinary cross-sensory alchemy. It starts recognizing it through affect. The way she sings reminds me of my grandmother, right? Her voice. You're listening to my voice. You're listening to all those parameters of the sound, and what you have in your head is really not storing the sound as is. So that's another thing to comprehend. So the framing of the brain as a sound analyzer, I may be hugely unpopular for saying this, especially in engineering university. This obsession with thinking of the brain as a sound analyzer also has not done much justice to the field, because we're very, very rooted in the scientific investigations of how sound came to be in our world. So we're obsessed with Helmholtz's idea that the ear is a very sensitive frequency analyzer. Do we hear every sound in space? Do you think you're using your visual skills to cognize sound? Yeah. But we almost always say visual processing and auditory processing. And in whom is this all happening? The person is completely forgotten in the game of perception. So this tendency to think of music perception at the level of tone, sound, and psychoacoustical aspects, vibration, pitch tracking, right? Visualizing the gamakas of music as, let's say a gamaka as like Sariga, then visualizing that as a spectrogram and saying, I love the way it shuffles between 220 and 320. So all of these, or Sariga as a nice little tremolo that does these drastic jumps between various frequencies. These are nice, I would say, explorations of sound, but they do not explain the larger, more hierarchical, the more heuristic process that is in place when you hear an alap, for example, when you hear a kriti, for example, when you hear music, real music, your brain is not functioning as a sound analyzer for sure. So in Western psychology and in Western music cognition, the brain as a signal processor has had mainstay. And in fact, it's still the dominant way in which Western psychology thinks of how the brain perceives sound. It looks at music as the biggest travesty is that it looks at music as stimulus. The second travesty is that it thinks of the ear as a sensory recipient organ. And then it thinks of the brain as a mastermind who's putting this whole cognitive process together, one small piece at a time. And what's the problem with this? If your poor brain and ear had to do this synchrony and symphony, then we would all be perceiving music pretty much like an amoeba, at the rate at which an amoeba can process music. But no, you're all processing now music and sound with such quick turnaround time, as they say, right? How's the brain able to do that? Where is intelligence in this process? You think the ear is a dumb recipient organ? Are you all listening to every sound that's being thrown at you right now? Are you? How many of you feel that your ear, poor little ear, is listening to every single sound that's being thrown at you? You would all be schizophrenic if that happened. So Raghuji is here. The Yoga Sutras model of the mind says that, there's attention unless you attend to it, and unless it is desirable, if there's an antahkarana that wants to experience that sound, no perception will happen. Perception is impossible to happen. And thankfully, you are blocking out a variety of hums and ambient noises here so that you can listen to this masterpiece speaking here, isn't it? So the problem with this is fully disconnected with. So in this linear dimension or linear pathway, music is a stimulus. The recipient organ of the ear has no intelligence or memory. There is no smriti at the level of the ear. It does not, poor thing listens to everything and then processes these things to the brain, which constructs reality. The problem with this pathway, first, what do you think is the first problem with this extra simplified processing pathway? It does not explain interpersonal variance, does it? Do you all respond to every piece of music the same way? No two people sitting in the same musical performance have the same experience. If musical stimulus is the same, the cognitive limits of the ear is the same. And your brain, more or less, thankfully, is the same in its processing abilities. Then how do you explain interpersonal variance in experience? So thankfully, the Indic view understands. I'm oversimplifying this because in the interest of time, it's very difficult to actually go into the actual context in which this was said. The Indic view, very simply put, thinks of perception, whether it is visual perception, olfactory perception, auditory perception, or whatnot. It thinks of it as a triangle. It's a triangle of what is heard, what is being, what the person who's hearing it, and the process of hearing, right? It's always a triangulation of the product, person, and process, irrespective of whether your currency is sound, irrespective of whether your currency is touch, irrespective of whether your currency is visual stimulus. So now this is a diametrically opposite view to the mainstream Western psychology. Because when you bring the person into the process, what all do you bring? Exactly. When you bring the product, so we have all dealt with product. When you bring the process into the picture, context. So now this turns itself into an extremely complex system with all geniuses here. So what are some of the features of complicated, complex systems? Non-linearity, then nested behavior, emergence, then chaos too, very important, chaos. Chaos is a very big part of this. And the Natya Shastra was written to manage that chaos in performance. If the actor is doing random things on a stage which is randomly organized, and the musician with the kutapa is playing random ragas, and the text in which this song is emanating to, let's say, portray the arrival of Rama, who's dhira rasa pradhanavadantaha vyakti, and Rama is coming on stage, and then the musician's like feeling pretty depressed. So he's just saying, what happens? Chaos. There's no coherence between the uttered, the composed, the heard, the visualized, right? So Natya Shastra was in fact written to actually create a greater degree of coherence between the various elements of Indian theatrical performance. So chaos and distribution of intelligence and memory across the whole system, isn't it? That's a significant feature of complex systems. Exactly. Context. right? Who, and then who is perceiving it, and whether your grandfather sang a lullaby in the same raga, for example, right? I sing a song to you, you hear a raga, what's the first thing you do? Oh, Asu Bhari hai. This song is in the same raga, isn't it? You have autobiographical memories. That's what they're called. You have an inner memory, you have an inner bank of sounds which you've heard since you're a child. It's there in your subconscious. You pull that out and then you engage with sound quickly using those autobiographical memories. So memory in such a system is actually distributed throughout this product person process system. And hence, this is what the rasa theory actually encapsulates, that what is heard, what is cognized, is actually at this very fertile plexus between culture and cognition, where with the person comes his cultural bias, his ethnicity, his exposure to the kind of music he's hearing, his educational status, his individual memories, his autobiographical memories, his cognitive limits, right? His neuroanatomical limits, his the space in which you're hearing the music, the time at which you're hearing the music, all of these parameters are determinants, right? Which is what the rasa theory says, that the rasa sutra says that the rasotpatti happens as a consequence of certain determinants, certain adjuvants, and certain transitory states or vyabhichari bhavas. So it's exactly this. So a neuroaesthetic model of music, when you superimpose the Rasa Sutra or the Rasa theory on this, would look something like this. There is intelligence, there is design thinking at the level of the music that is being heard. There is some amount of variation that the person brings, who the person brings to the game. And then there are basically two kinds of ways in which the mind perceives music. One is the sensory perception. When you hear sa, a, e, u, o, you're sensorily responding to the sound. Right? There's just a bodily sensation that the sound creates in you. And then there is the cognitive processing that also comes with dil hum kare ghabraye. Now you're saying mera dil. There are direct references. Whose dil? My dil is doing whom. Right? All of these things are happening. So there is cognitive appreciation and processing of the music at that level. But you're also subliminally responding to the melody. Dil hum kare ghabraye. You're also responding to the way in which I modulate my voice, when I actually open my mouth a little too much, and things like that. So sensory perception, which is called in our epistemological parlance nirvikalpa pratyaksha and savikalpa pratyaksha, because vastu shunyo vikalpa. So something that is full of the object of perception is the savikalpa pratyaksha, and something that is devoid of the object of perception is nirvikalpa pratyaksha. Timbre, the quality is called timbre, because my mouth cavity is a certain shape and his mouth cavity is a different shape, and the way in which I enunciate my I can do so it changes the quality of the sound. No, the timbre is basically the quality of the sound, which varies from person to person. My voice has a timbre. Like Kailash Kher's voice, like that to answer that question, two people singing the same note with the same frequency and the same amplitude and the same volume will have two different timbres. Yeah, there are timbre measurable parameters also.
So even if I don't have anything to do with lyrics, like Beethoven music or something which I don't know Indian language, Iranian, Middle Eastern. I'm equally happy as I do any kind of soft Indian music. So it's a type of music, the frequencies that you generate and how you resonate with it.
Yeah. So I'm saying that the frequency is really not the be all and end all of the game. And you're sitting in a symphonic orchestra. Are you listening to love the 330 to 440 frequency range of the trombone? You're not doing that.
It's a big part of it. I'm not saying it's all about it. It's a big part of it.
Yes.
I'm trying to isolate that the cognitive thing that you bring from lyrics, right? It's not the only from the lyrics.
Yes.
Something else.
Very important point. The Natya Shastra basically distinguishes music into two categories cognitively. One with Sahitya or prosody, and an absolute music without lyric, because they're processed in entirely two different ways in the brain. Because we are a speech-oriented species, we have these two extraordinary centers in the brain called the Broca's areas and the Wernicke's area. If there is a song with lyric which is able to give a direct reference of what I'm talking about, then the speech areas win most often over the melody areas, because melody is a more subliminal experience. And so the frequency of the melody gets subjugated to the direct references of whether it is Padumanabha, Paramapurusha, Paranjoti Swarupa. So that lyric tends to dominate the creation of meaning, so to speak.
The question that Vivek had, I think it's from that what we can measure. If you measure the signal, right, as a sound signal, whatever we can measure, where is timbre in it? What measurement gives any clue about timbre that you talked about?
So if
we can measure amplitude, we can measure frequency.
Some of it is not. Some of it is intangible because it comes from having a body. The timbre comes from having a body of a certain shape. Moti opera singer. Have you heard that phrase? Opera singers have to have a very large body to be able to hold those frequencies and emanate those frequencies. So yeah, some of them are intangible qualities of a voice, and some of them are measurable.
That's what his question was.
Yeah.
We don't see that in the signals. Whatever we record,
because some of the signal measuring instruments are only measuring what we want to measure.
What they can measure, not just what we can measure.
One way to think about it is that from a statistical point of view, the mean might be the same, the standard deviation might be the same, but it could cause some higher level movements.
I know. So there might be things.
So you can keep on approximating to whatever levels of movements.
And then the Bayesian spread of the sound, the Bayesian spread of the many microtonal elements. So when I say sir, there may be a Bayesian spread that is very different when I say sir and when somebody else holds the sir.
So that's the question.
The Brownian motion of the microtonal frequencies that are evoked when you actually approach a central frequency also may contribute to timbre related differences, if you want to actually go geek on that. Okay. Can I proceed? Okay.
I think the memory component of the entire perception of music.
Oh God.
So when you talk about memory, what kind of memory? It's like accurate memory. Well, let's say I'll give you an example. Let's say, in my life, I've never heard chords, but when I went, sorry.
Little louder.
Yeah, so the memory, like where from in what part memory plays and what kind of memory it is. Is it the accurate memory or it is the collective memory that we're talking about here?
What is collective memory?
Yeah, so this is what I was saying, in my life, before I went abroad, I never heard choirs. So then I heard choir, it was equally enjoyable to me, but it is nothing that I have ever heard before in my life. And it is equally enjoyable. I could perceive, I could take a lot of enjoyment from it. I was happy after it. So what form of memory is giving me this backup mechanism that you have mentioned, or feedback mechanism that actually played a role in it?
So memory is neurological memory is only of two kinds. One is potentiated memory. So if your brain has constantly, let's say, heard raga music, then it has a preference to hearing consonants more than dissonance. If you have always heard jazz, then the brain basically prefers to listen to only dissonant chord progressions. And so so for first time you heard a choir, I'm pretty sure that you didn't hear all the harmonies. It is impossible because you don't have a memory at the level of the ear to fully perceive the 4th, 6th, 7th and 9th harmonies that are there in a choir. And then with more and more exposure, you develop more and more memory at the level of the ear also.
It is actually a training network.
It's a training network where there's potentiation, there's preference for that kind of sounds, and the brain starts generating heuristical shortcuts to actually cognize those kinds of sounds quickly instead of computing them.
So you built up clues from your previous exposure, basically.
Yep.
You build connections from
I
that.
just want to interject. These are all very exciting questions, but we also have to move.
Yeah, exactly. You can all come to the lecture demonstration at 7 p.m. also. And perception, music perception, like most perception, is a trade-off. It's a trade-off between precision, accuracy, and the speed of processing that's required in the moment. So this is what we learned in the jungle orchestra. Imagine you're a human being, you're Tarzan sitting on a tree, and you hear the buzz of bees. What is the speed at which your perception has to happen? Very fast. So there is an evolutionary requirement. There's a survivorship-based requirement that has trained our musical perception system in this way. So the brain man that I showed you before is not a superhero of sorts. He's more of a survivor. He hears in the jungle. He's not thinking, isosynchronous rhythms, 440 BPM. I like that. That's like Trishra, Chatushra. No, he doesn't have time to do that. It's a trade-off between run. It's a herd of elephants, right? So the perceptual system we have inherited is also one that allows the human being to survive in an extremely chaotic auditory environment. And hence, it makes these very quick heuristical approximations because the speed at which such things should be processed is very high. So that's about the neuroaesthetic aspect of how we have to look beyond sound processing when you're looking at music perception. And that makes generating a mathematical model of music perception an extremely difficult endeavor. If we do have to finally include the person, product, and the process in this equation. So, as a small case in point, and to end my talk, I don't know if we have the time. It's already 6 o'clock. I'll skip the Natya Shastra. Do I have 5 more minutes to wrap this up, or 5 minus 1? Okay. So I'm going to give you a proof of concept of how ragas were engineered. So how many notes should make a raga? Any guesses? Can you have a raga of 4 notes? 5 notes? Can you have a raga of 2 notes? Why not? How much is an octave? 8. Why do you necessarily need saptaswaras? So these are questions that were answered in the Natya Shastra. So if you actually do a reverse engineering of what was written down in the Natya Shastra, one of the questions that the Natya Shastra has dealt with is how to make ragas, jatis as they were called in the Natya Shastra. The word raga is a fairly modern term. How to make ragas with distinct emotional rasa content. That was the question. That was their engineering problem. And so they went about going it this way. So Bharata Muni's solution to this was he created a heptet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. At the center of this heptet is the madhyama. and that is symmetrically poised between the two trichords, 3 notes, this way and that way. A raga or a jati in which there's perfect consonances between its component notes. This is called the Samvada theory in Natya Shastra. Can generate a sthai bhava, can generate an emotion or a rasa that is stable. So this is how they engineered perceptual outcomes in ragas. So the center of this system is the madhyama, and the grama system of music, which was in vogue before the Melakartas, is rooted in this idea of perfect consonances, dissonances between its component notes, and there are some imparts from this study. What we understand is that every small interval of sa to re to ga, pa to dha is always heard in a hierarchy of choices. It is always heard in the context of larger intervals of the Shadja Madhyama or the Sa and Pa, Shadja Panchama Bhava as they understand it. So the brain is also not looking at every interval that is being thrown at it. There is something called the affect heuristic. I am looking at Re and Ga, the intervals between Sa to Re to Ga, in the context of this larger interval of the Sa and Ma. I'm looking at these notes in the larger intervals of Shadja Panchama Bhava. And these are all musicological grammar that we understand. But behind this is this perceptual theory of how the brain actually does not view every individual interval incrementally. It looks at smaller intervals in the context of larger intervals. And hence the Tanpura is always giving you these achala swaras of Shadja, Madhyama and Shadja, or Shadja Panchama. That is because they are the stable consonant intervals, they are the womb that is being created in which the physiologies of this raga or scale is being hand dropped into. Secondly, intervallic semantics. Bharata Muni describes that not all swaras are born equal. There's a sociology of swaras, the vadis and the samavadis. If there is a vadi, most important note is the re, then it's most likely that the dhaivata becomes its samavadi. The perceptual game in a raga is afforded by how much symmetry or asymmetry is afforded between its notes. Anuvadis are pakkavadyas. If the re is not agreeing to the ga, then it's called a vivadi note. It wants to pull away from the Gandhara's consonants, then it's a vivadi. It says, I want to nicely join you, then it's an anuvadi. So there's a sociology of swaras that Bharata Muni sort of describes, and the sociology is not based on the physical properties of these notes, of whether one note is a perfect integer or the physico-acoustic properties of these notes, but the perceptual aspects of how the brain may actually perceive these structures in time, right? And tonal entropy. Highly intervallic symmetries. Yes, I have to answer that.
Is there a evolutionary reason for this ability to look at it from the intervallic semantics?
Is there a
evolutionary perspective?
Yes, that's precisely why I was talking about the jungle orchestra.
No, you mean to say that to detect all these elephant kind of situations, you're saying intervallic semantics is useful. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, imagine a jungle. You have such a rich orchestra of sounds thrown at you. If you start listening to every single sound at the level of its frequencies, you will be schizophrenic. You will hear so many patterns. So the brain is really not a pattern decoder either. It is basically reading things differently and constructing meaning differently. At least that's what, I'm not saying this. This is Bharata Muni saying this. And Patanjali also said the same thing. And tonal entropy. If a raga is highly unstable, like there's two little consonants between its notes, and this madhyam is like turbulent and wanting to reach towards the pancham. If such drama is actually unfolding in a scale, then such scales which have high amount of sonic entropy are not tolerated by the ear well, or they can be judiciously used in scenarios where there's a lot of turmoil, like a war scene in the Natya Shastra. So, if you look at it, there is a perceptional center to every scale. Not every swara is actually perceived equally. All swaras are not born equal in the vision of Bharat Muni. And secondly, and most importantly, the tipping point of every scale, which is the affect heuristic, is the madhyama. So if there's high entropy in the sariga, then most probably the brain will estimate it to be a high entropy raga for the rest of it, no matter what comes after it. That's called the affect heuristic. You may have perfect consonances here, but if you first heard dissonance in the first half of the raga, the purvanga and the uttaranga as they're called, if the purvanga is highly entropic, the brain is more likely to perceive the whole scale as a turbulent raga. So there are ragas with that kind of quality, and this becomes the basis for the Chaturdandi Prakashika. For all the musicological geeks out here, you may ask, Western music, any Western musicians? Last thing. Minor scale and major scale, which is the tipping point in Western music? It's Gandhara. Sagapa is major, Sagapa is minor. So the tipping point, the affect heuristic in Western music, is the Gandhara. The reason till today, Venkatamaki, Chaturdandi Prakashika to Swaramela Kalanidhi, to every practitioner in Indian classical music, the Madhyama and the Pratimadhyama becomes the primary basis for classifying ragas, right? That's 72 Melakartas are the same scale with a Pratimadhyama equivalent is likely to be classified in a totally different manner. So this is the reason why this idea has also persisted. This is the reason why we have the Melakarta scheme also operating at the level of the Madhyama tipping point. So to finish, why should we be bothered about all of this? Coming back to the same question. We have never developed a comprehensive neuroaesthetic model for perception of Indian classical music. The Western musicians have managed to do that for their system. And we have never asked these deeper questions about how our music is perceived and the Indic knowledge that's embedded and embodied in the Natya Shastra, the Naradiya Shiksha, Charangadeva's works, Matanga's Brihadeshi, all of these things behind and beyond the enunciated musicological jargon have a certain cognitive knowledge that's embodied in these musicological texts, which could be mined to actually come up with a new music perception model for the world, and not just for India. But it may eventually cross-fertilize how the brain perceives and cognizes sound. So thank you very much